As the country's largest and most populated city, New York uses a lot of electricity. In fact, more than most states and even several developed countries. But throughout the year, we don't always use the same amount of electricity. In fact, between the seasons, our demand varies significantly. Those moments when we use the greatest amount of electricity during any period of time, be it a day, week, month, or year, we call peak demand periods. New York City's peak demand for the entire year always happens during hot, sunny summer afternoons. That's when everyone cranks up their air conditioners to make it through the sweltering heat. Air conditioners use a lot of electricity. It's not a coincidence, this is also when the city experiences the greatest risk of power failures, or blackouts. Adding more solar photovoltaic or PV systems to New York City's billions of square feet of vacant roof space in the coming years would boost local power reliability and decrease the likelihood of summer power failure. In order to understand why, it's necessary to understand how it is that power failures happen. Power plants are the most visible pieces of our electricity system, and there are over 20 of them in the 5 boroughs. While many of us would assume that blackouts happen as a result of a power plant failing or even running out of electricity on a hot day, they are in fact rarely responsible. Instead, power failures typically originate in the grid, which is what we call the enormous, mostly underground network that connects power plants to millions of electricity end users. Together, power plants and the grid make up what we call a centralized electricity system. New York City's grid is reliable the vast majority of the time, but during hot, sunny summer afternoons, risk of failure increases dramatically. That's because at these points, the amount of power consumed by users can exceed the capacity of parts of the grid to safely transport it. It's simply too much electricity moving through the system. This causes vulnerable parts to break down and blackouts to occur. How can adding more PV to New York City rooftops help solve this problem in the long term? The answer has to do with the when and the where of PV, or the timing and the location. First, the when, or the timing of PV. While PV systems don't always produce power, they happen to have the greatest output right around the same time that we use the greatest amount of electricity, during the day, and in particular, sunny summer afternoons. The reason for this coincidence is obvious. The heat that causes us to turn up our air conditioners and the light that PV systems convert into electricity have the exact same source, the sun. The other important factor is the where, or the location of PV systems, which happens to be on the rooftops of the buildings that use the power that they produce. Therefore, in contrast to the conventional centralized electricity system, which involves large power plants delivering power to hundreds of thousands of customers through the electricity grid, PV is a form of distributed generation. This means that it is spread out in smaller amounts on or close to the point of consumption, and therefore does not rely on the grid to deliver power to end users. Now, if we consider these two factors together, the timing and location of PV, it becomes obvious how adding more of the technology to New York City's rooftops could help mitigate power failures in the future. Let's imagine a typical building on a hot, sunny summer afternoon when air conditioner demand spikes. At this point, the building would normally draw the greatest amount of power from the grid. Now imagine if that building had a PV system installed on its roof at that very same point. That system would be generating electricity at close to its peak output. And whatever electricity that the solar panels produce would go right from the roof into the building without having to move through the grid. By producing some or all of its power at that moment, rather than receiving it from the centralized system, the building would put less strain on the electricity grid right when failure is most likely to take place. But how much PV is necessary to have a positive impact on reliability during peak summer demand periods? In other words, how much PV distributed across vacant roof space does it take to prevent a blackout? Scientists at the State University of New York's Atmospheric Science Research Center in Albany have measured the levels of incoming solar radiation during recent historical blackouts in the New York area. With that data, they are able to estimate how much PV located within an affected area would have been sufficient to prevent those failures from happening. The Great Northeast Blackout of August 2003 was the largest failure in history, leaving 50 million people without power and exacting upwards of $10 billion in economic damages. How much PV could have prevented it? According to the ASRC team's measurements, as little as 200 to 300 megawatts of PV in the areas of highest demand would have been adequate. That's the equivalent in output of a single small power plant. Given the high economic cost that would have been averted had the blackout not happened, an investment in PV of this size would have paid for itself in a single instant.